Good afternoon. My name is Julie Wong. I'm from the Alzheimer Society of Toronto. I would like to welcome you to the fourth webinar in the Advances in Dementia Research series presented by the Alzheimer Society of Toronto, as well as the Toronto Dementia Research Alliance. This series discusses recent updates in dementia research and highlights dementia research studies occurring across Toronto. Before we officially begin, I would like to get a sense of who is with us today. So I'm just going to pull up a few poll questions. The first question, is what category do you identify with? Are you a clinician, healthcare professional? Are you a researcher? Are you someone living with dementia? Are you a caregiver or a family member? Are you a staff from another community organization? And other. And if you selected other, I would love if you could share with me in the chat box what that role might be or that category would be. So it looks like we also have volunteer. Perfect. Thank you for letting me know. So it looks like we have a nice mix. Some family caregivers, some clinicians, some of almost every group. So a fairly even mix. Okay. I'll just wait a couple more seconds in case people wanted to respond to that poll. So the next question, just for my own reference, is how did you find out about this webinar? Okay, so mostly through an email or a newsletter, but also friends, colleagues, social media, okay, but predominantly through an email or newsletter. Okay, perfect. And then the last question I have for you is, have you attended a previous Advances in Research webinar? So this is the fourth webinar that we've hosted. So I'm just wondering if you have participated before. Okay, thank you. So some yeses, but the majority is no. So we try to host one every 2-3 months or so. So if this is something of interest to you, I would encourage you to stay tuned. Okay, thank you so much for sharing with me. So today, our speaker is going to be presenting on updates regarding genetic and lifestyle risk factors for Alzheimer's disease, including differences in population groups. So I'm going to share with you my screen briefly. Okay. Is doing something funny. Okay. And our speaker will be Dr. Wei Huang Yu, and Natalie will be introducing our speaker briefly. But before we do that, if you are not already familiar with the Alzheimer's Society of Toronto, I would actually like to take a little bit of time to introduce our society to you. So the Alzheimer's Society of Toronto provides free counseling, education, programming, and information to people living with dementia, care partners, so family members and friends or neighbors, whoever is considered a care partner, healthcare professionals, as well as the general public. You do not need to have a diagnosis of dementia in order to be serviced by the Alzheimer's Society of Toronto, and we service all dementias. So could be Alzheimer's disease, could be vascular dementia, could be any type of dementia. Our main office, the contact information is listed below. We also do have 3 other satellite sites that are listed on our webpage. Some other things that I wanted to share with you is that if you would like to make a referral to the Alzheimer's Society, anyone can make a referral. So you can even self-refer. The only things that we do ask for is if you are referring someone else, that you have their consent. So whether it's the person living with dementia or the care partner, we do require consent in order to be able to reach out to them. We also do have an education platform, alzeducate.ca, that you can access a variety of education. So it could be self-paced, or it could be real-time education. You do need to sign up for an account in order to access that information, but there are things that we offer on a regular basis. And so if you are interested in seeing everything the Alzheimer's Society of Toronto has to offer, you can check out our calendar of events for everything that we have. I'd now like to introduce the Toronto Dementia Research Alliance. So the Toronto Dementia Research Alliance was established in 2012 and is a collaboration amongst the University of Toronto and affiliated academic hospitals, including Baycrest, the Centre of Addiction and Mental Health, Ontario Shore Centre for Mental Health Sciences, Sunnybrook Health Sciences Centre, and the University Health Network. The TDRA is working together to better understand, prevent, and treat dementia by creating a stronger link between basic science and clinical research, embedding research into care, improving outreach and education to the community, and increasing the efficiency of collaborative research processes across the city. I'd like to now hand it off to Natalie to introduce the rest.
Thanks, Julie. So my name is Natalie Dren. I am a research coordinator focused on knowledge translation at the Toronto Dementia Research Alliance. So TDRA and AST have partnered to make research more accessible to everyone. The Toronto Dementia Network, or the TDN, is a website that lists dementia-related programs and services across Toronto. And on this website, we created a new section called Research Studies, which lists dementia studies that are open for participation across the city. So each study that's listed is led by TDRA affiliated scientists, and all the studies have been approved by a research ethics board. There are studies for people with Alzheimer's disease and other types of dementia, mild cognitive impairment, those at risk of developing dementia, and healthy volunteers and caregivers. So the studies are all summarized in plain language, and to get started, the website link is shown on this slide in orange, and information about the TDN can also be found on both the AST and TDRA websites if you're looking for it. Next slide. And on the website, there are 2 main pathways. So first, in the dark blue up top, you could browse for a study using search terms or filters or quick searches. And then when you find the study you're interested in, you can fill out the contact form that's connected to it, and you'll be connected with the research team who will enroll you for the study if you're eligible. Or at the bottom in gray, if you're not quite sure where to start, you can fill out a questionnaire to be matched to a study. And any information you enter anywhere on the TDN website will be securely stored and protected. Next slide. Thank you. So this is what the website actually looks like. If you just search Toronto Dementia Network and not research studies specifically, you can get to the research studies section by clicking the tab along the top right, which I've circled here in red. And then when you're on the page, if you're looking for something specific, so for example, Alzheimer's disease, or you know the name of the study you're looking for, you can type it in the search bar along the top. And then you could either submit with that term alone or apply more filters like the type of study, age group, target population, the study location, and then hit submit. Alternatively, you could use the quick search buttons we have in blue boxes here, or you can search using filters without using a search term at all. So for example, just clicking on a type of study or a target population from the drop-down options in the filter menus. If you'd rather fill out a questionnaire to be matched to a study, click the Match Me to a Study quick search box, or you can scroll to the bottom of the page and you'll see this orange button that says, "Can't find a study you're interested in." And this will also take you to a questionnaire that will match you to a study. Each study summary, so as shown in the Acad study example on the left, describes what the study's about, who can participate, the location, and the time requirement. And again, this is all in plain language. So you can move to the next slide. Okay, and now I'd like to introduce our speaker. And before I do, just a reminder to keep any questions till the end of the webinar, and we will have a question and answer period while we're trying to get to all of them. So we're grateful to be joined today by Dr. Ho Yu. Dr. Yu is an independent scientist at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health with appointments in the Brain Health and Imaging Center and the Geriatric Mental Health Research Division. He is also an assistant professor in pharmacology and toxicology at the University of Toronto. His research focuses on how proteins build up in brain cells in diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, and how lived events like cardiovascular or sleep changes impact disease onset and progression. So welcome, Dr. Yu, and we look forward to hearing about your work and the Acad study.
Thank you, Natalie, and thank you, Julie. Thank you to the audience for attending. One of the best things I can do in terms of my research is to share what we do, as well as to help the community understand dementia and other diseases. So I'm looking forward to interacting with this group and think of this as not just current, but as a continuing dialogue on this. So thank you very much for the Alzheimer's Society of Toronto and the Toronto Dementia Research Alliance, TDRA, for organizing this event. So my research, my talk today will be on diversifying research in Alzheimer's disease and identifying risk and protective factors in Asian populations. But what I want to do is actually take a step back from just thinking about Asian populations, but thinking about Alzheimer's disease and dementia as a whole. We currently have about 600 to 700,000 individuals in Canada with dementia, largely Alzheimer's disease. This will increase to almost 1 million by 2031, so less than a decade from now. Not including the cost to individuals, that's insurmountable. The healthcare costs itself are expected to double in this time. So there's going to be a 40% increase over 15 years, and the costs will double. The estimate is that in Canada, up to 1.4 million by the 2031 will have some form of dementia. And that's very similar to across the globe in terms of dementia cases. So this is becoming not just a health crisis, but it's also a person crisis. And taking a step back, what we want to do is revisit some of the work that's been done, as well as some of the work that should be happening to kind of address this in a faster and more meaningful way. So I'm going to take a step back. For those who might not be familiar with what happens in the brain in Alzheimer's disease, I've got a few slides here. This is something called an amyloid plaque or a senile plaque. It's formed by this protein or peptide that's called amyloid. And basically it's a little bit like tartar in your teeth. It just kind of gums up. And what you can see in here in some of these darker pictures is actually brain cells called neurons and their connections being kind of stuck in this. And so it's a fairly toxic substance. It gets secreted by the cells or dying neurons and then forms these plaques. The other major pathology in Alzheimer's disease is something called the neurofibrillary tangle. This is composed of a protein called tau. And this happens inside the cell. And what happens then is it actually gums up inside the cells and causes the brain cells to not function properly. So these are two major pathologies. And we also know that there's inflammation in the brain cells. So it doesn't necessarily respond to some of these kind of insults as well as it should. And ultimately, you lose some of the connections between the brain cells and some of the brain cells themselves. So this discovery was made by Alzheimer in 1906 and published in that decade. And since then, it's really kind of been the central focus of Alzheimer's disease is what's going on with this pathology and how should we address this type of thing. But as our science and our research has continued on, we've started to kind of really expand the scope of what goes on in Alzheimer's disease. Some of the earliest work in terms of genetics was in the late 80s and onto the early 90s, where we identified the genes that might be impacting the amyloid or senile plaque deposition. It's actually, some of the seminal work was done in Toronto with Peter St. George Hislop group at the University of Toronto, and I was fortunate enough to be part of that group when they made some of the early discoveries. And these genes actually are mutations that occur in small families causing an early form of Alzheimer's disease, and they kind of centralize around the amyloid on that. Since then, there have been other gene mutations that I've identified that are associated with tau that cause other dementias like frontotemporal lobar dementia. Taking that knowledge of both the tau and the amyloid in the lab, and since pretty well since the 70s, 60s and 70s onwards, there's been a lot of work thinking about how these proteins develop, how they build, using test tubes in the lab, using cells to model how some of these proteins take place, how they appear in the cell, how they might get removed from the cell, things like that. And then using some of the genetics actually is to develop some of these animal models so that we can start to kind of model it in a animal and kind of help to recapitulate some of the ideas in terms of pathology and how to reverse them on there. Add to that, we have population genetics. And this has been something in the last decade that's really taken a forefront in terms of understanding Alzheimer's disease. We know that Alzheimer's disease has this basic pathology, but there's actually a lot of genes that are associated with brain function in both the neurons, which are the brain cells that are most commonly associated with learning and memory, and the astrocytes and microglia, which are part of this neuroinflammation, neuroinflammatory protective response. And so we start to build up all this data on what's going on in the cells from population genetics on this. And then finally, something that's been really kind of helping to reduce the risk and reduce the progression of Alzheimer's is understanding these lifestyle risk factors. The lived experience is a huge component of what happens in Alzheimer's disease. And it's really come to the forefront in recent years to help reduce the risk and progression of Alzheimer's disease. But they cover the gamut in terms of everything that can go on in the brain. You have everything from the cardiovascular changes in the heart, in blood vessels in the brain, potential strokes or infarcts that might happen in the brain that can cause memory loss. Diabetes, Alzheimer's is considered type 3 diabetes because it reduces the brain function when you have this type of insulin resistance in the brain. This is stress and depression as just a potential effect that kind of increases your risk of Alzheimer's disease and often presents in people with Alzheimer's disease. About 30%, 1 in 3 or 1 in 4 people have some level of depression on this, and it could potentially be an early sign of events. Some of the work that I do in my lab is study sleep and how that might kind of be involved in terms of the protein buildups, and that's actually some of the research I do, as well as how it kind of affects memory and learning. And finally, while this couple looks like they're enjoying they're sitting down and watching television, it also, the sedentary lifestyle is an important factor in risk factor in Alzheimer's disease. And I'll get onto this a little bit more as we progress into the talk. So a Lancet commission. So Lancet is one of the premier medical journals, had a commission where they identified that basically about 40% of potential risk factors are modifiable in terms of the progression of Alzheimer's disease. So when you kind of consider this like poorly drawn diagram that I've made, there are a lot of factors that kind of play into how we get to mild cognitive impairment in Alzheimer's disease. But if there's about 40% of this that might be modifiable, this does two things. One, reduces the potential for Alzheimer's disease, and two, reduces the speed of progression, improving the quality of life for individuals. So overall, we can't think of Alzheimer's disease as just being this plaque and this tangle. That's the end point. But how we get there is so diversified. there are multiple variables that kind of lead to this common disease. So this is something I want to kind of present to you, and hopefully, if you have questions, we'll be able to address them in this seminar or definitely in research as we kind of go on studying this. And therapies have often focused on one event. So we kind of call this monotherapy. So a lot of the work has been looked at has been targeting amyloid plaques. There's only been one drug, Aduhelm, which was recently approved in the United States for this type of treatment, but by and large, they have failed. Others included target tau removal, helping restore some of this proper neuroinflammation process and preserving brain function. And what we've actually found is some of the maintaining health, healthy living might be actually one of our best bets in terms of covering Alzheimer's disease or preventing it in the short term. I'm going to give you 3 studies that kind of are around the globe that help to kind of confirm some of that work. The religious order, the School of Sisters of Notre Dame congregation, there were 700 enrollees in the early 90s. All these individuals were about 80 years old, 70 to 80 years old when they were enrolled in the study. And the goal was to kind of test the cognitive function. And then when they passed away, they generously donated their brains for research purposes. So we could take a look at what happens in their brains. And when I say we, it's a bit of the royal we. I wasn't around for these studies, but this is part of the community research that's gone on. They did find tangles, these tau tangles in the hippocampus and neocortex, which is part of the brain area that's involved with thinking and learning and memory. But they did notice that there was a reduced infarct, so reduced kind of some of the cardiovascular changes that happen in your brain that are associated often with strokes, be it large or mini strokes. They also identified that education, i.e. early life linguistic usage, was a very good risk modifier for dementia. Going over to Europe, we know people are quite familiar probably with the Mediterranean diet. These are whole grains, fresh fruits, olive oil, legumes, and fish. So they're high in anti-inflammatory, antioxidants, high in omega-3. And one of the special ingredients was polyphenols. So that's like something like resveratrol, which is the active compound found in red wine or grapes. And they're meant to be antioxidants or mitochondrial enhancers. So mitochondria are the powerhouse of cells. So they basically drive all the energy through that. So if you increase your energy in the brain cells, in the mitochondria, then you increase the activity of brain cells. And overall, in the Mediterranean diet studies, they identified that there's reduced cognitive decline in older adults, the greatest at-risk population for dementia and Alzheimer's disease. There was reduced risk of mild cognitive impairment, the preceding for dementia, where you start to have some memory loss. And there was a reduced progression to Alzheimer's disease from mild cognitive impairment. So overall, what they noted was that low sugar, low processed foods, low trans fat, fatty acids, and lower red meat consumption often helped improve the outcome on that. And this isn't just necessarily in North America and Asia that we can identify some potential healthy living aspects when it comes to diet and other activities. In Asia, there was a study that started off in Japan, Fukuoka and Okinawa, as well as also went into Hong Kong, where they looked at centenarians, so people who've lived over 100 years, and kind of examined what they did. What was that special ingredient in their lives that made a potential difference in reducing the risk of Alzheimer's disease and increasing healthy living overall? What they noticed was a high carb but not processed diet, lower protein intake, greater daily exercise, and social connections were really valuable in reducing cardiovascular disease and diabetes and improving memory. So there was a reduced risk of ApoE4. This is a protein that's involved that increases your risk of Alzheimer's disease. I'll get to it a little bit later. FOXO3 is a cancer and Alzheimer's disease related gene that can modify some of the outcomes. They noted that with reduced stress, as I mentioned before, depression can be a mitigating factor in Alzheimer's disease. Reduced stress, spirituality and meditation, as well as increased social family connections are really valuable. So I mentioned omega-3s, so I can add to that phytochemicals, flavonoids, carotenoids. So these are found in a lot of colorful vegetables, help to reduce some of the inflammatory response. And I mentioned proteostasis. This is something I do in my lab. This is research on basically the life cycle of a protein. And in Alzheimer's disease and other neurodegenerative diseases, the life cycle of the protein gets stopped. And so instead of basically recycling the protein at the end of its lifespan, it actually tends to gum up in the cells. And this is what happens with both amyloid and tau. So instead of actually being processed or recycled, they end up kind of hanging around and forming these clumps, both outside the cell as well as inside the cell. So we've got 3 examples here of good living that can potentially help increase brain function. We know that exercise is also really important because it increases a trophic factor. And trophic factors are kind of healthy events that kind of help whatever cell that they're working on. And BDNF works on brain cells. And then other factors kind of help promote that brain function. I mentioned brain cells need to connect with each other, and amyloid tends to break them apart. You need those synapses because that's actually how learning and memory form on there. And of course, increased vascular health is really valuable to maintaining a healthy brain itself. And so you've got both direct effects and indirect effects when it comes to things like diet and exercise. Looking at this basic, very basic schematic of brain health on there. And diets themselves can also kind of be that balance of your healthy brain and potentially something that's more Alzheimer's at risk for that. And including in that is the polyphenols and antioxidants that I mentioned on this. Some of the more westernized diets have more processed foods, which tend not to be so helpful. And then the sedentary lifestyle itself can be potentially damaging to the brain just because there's less activity, there's less functioning on there, or there's lower blood flow. So those are kind of things to kind of think about when we discuss healthy brains on that. And going back to that Lancet Commission, they came up with some frameworks of what to consider when we start to think about a healthy brain and hopefully at some point prevention of dementia on that. And so we can reduce the damage that we saw, that amyloid plaques and the tau that I showed you at the beginning, and increasing that ability for the brain to kind of have those healthy connections so that they continue to work and function properly. One thing that I need to note, and it shouldn't be lost on the audience, is that Alzheimer's is a global dementia, a global phenomenon. So Canada relatively is a small country, but there's an aging population globally that's also taking place. In the United States, they have about 10 times the rate of dementia, and that's relative to the population. And that's going to continue onwards onto 2050 and onwards unless we have a cure or are able to really successfully mitigate it with some of these risk factor prevention programs. And then thinking about globally, we expect that it's going to be close to about 140, 150 million as a conservative estimate from the World Health Organization globally. So just think about that. That's about 4 times Canada's population right now, and potentially 2 to 3 times the population of Canada in 2050 of people with dementia worldwide. But one of the limitations of some of the research that goes on right now is that when I talked about some of the population genetics that we've kind of really helped to figure out what's going on with brain cells, it's been largely focused on Caucasian populations. And that's largely also because of where the situation is, where the studies are taking place, and who's joining in on these studies. But we know that not all genetics from Caucasian populations are seen in other groups. I'll get to some of the examples later on. And there's a hope that other genes that aren't as apparent in Caucasian populations might pop up in other research studies. So this has actually been a really big focus in the United States, is to kind of make sure that we have all the coverage of what's going on in Alzheimer's disease and not restricting it to some of the populations. And one of the big ones that came out was ApoE4. Lipoprotein is a protein that's involved with cholesterol transport. It's noted as a risk factor in Alzheimer's disease. So if you have ApoE4 versus the other form, which is dominant, which is ApoE3, you have a 5 times more likelihood of developing Alzheimer's disease. Now, this was done actually in Caucasian populations, and when they tried to repeat it in other populations, they haven't found that these results are as robust. In African Americans, there doesn't seem to be as much of an association. It's a smaller association in Hispanic populations, and there is in Asian populations, it actually depends on where in Asia that they look at, that the risk factors are different. In addition, some of the health outcomes can be impacted because in some of the hospital centers, the proportions of African American, Hispanic, Asian populations, First Nation populations are underrepresented in registries and clinical memory clinic programs. And there are a lot of sociological factors, there are a lot of health factors that go into this dynamic, but one of the things to think about is increasing parity on health outcomes is to also make sure that everyone is represented in these stories and in these studies. The lived experiences, I've kind of discussed this quite consistently, are also very different upon populations. So diabetes can affect some populations more than others. Diet is certainly very different across populations. So understanding some of these types of factors are significant on this. In the United States, there's a greater risk of developing Alzheimer's disease in African American populations, up to 2-fold. And in Hispanic populations, up to 1.5-fold compared to Caucasian populations. This isn't consistent in Asian populations, though one of the lacking effects is that there hasn't actually been enough studies in those populations. So understanding genetics and some of the lifestyle lived experience factors are really critical for our overall understanding of what's going on in Alzheimer's disease. And not that what happens in one population doesn't happen in another population. These factors all build into being able to predict a disease for all people, but understanding that some of these lived experiences can be unique among different populations, and they play a specific role in how one might develop cognitive impairment or progress to Alzheimer's disease. I'm going to take a few examples of what goes on in terms of between Caucasian and Asian populations and other populations. One of the things that I study in my lab is looking at some of the blood vessel changes that take place in your brain. Here we have something called a large blood vessel dilatation. This is more prominent as a cardiovascular problem in some Asian populations and Hispanic populations, and less so in Caucasian populations. But this can potentially impact progression to dementia, either vascular dementia or an Alzheimer's disease. We know enzymes, so these are the things that kind of break down drugs and things like that in the body. There might be some genetic variants on that. They're not mutations, they're just differences in the population on here. Here I have an example of someone an Asian gentleman who's had a drink of alcohol, actually 2 drinks, and you can see that this person is flushing. And this is a common event in about 1 in 5 Asians. This is related to an enzyme called Aldehyde Dehydrogenase. And we know that this increases, if you have this variant, increases stomach cancer, as well as newly found was potentially increases your risk of Alzheimer's disease. Diabetes is similar in terms of some of the risk if you have it in different populations. And finally, thinking about handling of drugs. So our body metabolizes drugs, and some of it works and some of it gets removed on this. And I'm taking the example of the Donepezil, which is called Aricept, and different people metabolize it differently. So if you're a fast metabolizer, you actually would need more Donepezil to have an effect. If you're slow metabolizer, because it doesn't clear the drug out as fast, you have more of a potential overdose effect on that. And then finally, kidney function or renal function is really important in a lot of populations, because we're finding that this is actually also a risk factor in Alzheimer's. So considering renal function might be also something we need to consider in the future on that. So overall, this talk kind of centers around how we're refining Alzheimer's research. understanding the heterogeneity of a population. And that's not just necessarily thinking about different ethnic groups, but we're also thinking about different lived experiences, your education, your diet, your exercise, your sleep, diabetes, how those might all play a role in this. And this kind of centers it down that when we start to think about Alzheimer's disease, it's not just that you have plaques and tangles in your brain, but some of those lived experiences might change how you get Alzheimer's disease, might change how you speeds it up and things like that. And this plays a role in how we eventually will diagnose Alzheimer's disease, and also potential thresholds. When we start to have a biomarker, are those biomarkers going to reflect the entire population? Or should we think about multiple biomarkers and kind of come up with a risk score on that? Thinking about Toronto, the population is aging like the rest of the world. And right now, 1 in 6 individuals in Toronto is over the age of 65. And that's going to be in 10 years, 1 in 5 people. And so the Alzheimer's and dementia risk in Toronto itself is going to increase. And it's better for us to start thinking about what we can do now for those with and those who are vulnerable to it, and then anything else. Toronto, like many global cities, is also experiencing something revolutionary in that it will become, or actually Toronto is already what we call a minority majority city, where there is no dominant population in society. As you can see, Europeans represent 2 in 5 individuals, Asians represent 1 in 3, and then we have increasing populations of basically all groups in here. So we have to kind of address some of the health issues that reflect all people. And when we start to think about seniors, while there's still a large population of Europeans, as immigration and diasporas start to kind of get to the successive generations, like 2nd and 3rd generations, you will start to see this increasing in terms of numbers. So research in Toronto, and especially at CAMH, is starting to reflect a more heterogeneous population when we start to think about health outcomes and things. And again, in Toronto, you start to see some of the average population changes, and you'll see that mostly it's European populations that now are more older, but you will start to see Asian populations start to kind of move down this band and increase in terms of percentages of that. And I should note that, I mean, for us, Asians represent the largest growing population in Toronto and GTA, and come the 2021 census results for immigration and ethnic diversity, also in Canada. And this is also reflective in the United States, where Asians were the fastest growing population in the 2020 census, and will increase to be the 2nd largest minority population after Hispanics in the United States come 2050, surpassing African Americans, who are currently double the population rate in the US. So this brings me to the Asian cohort for Alzheimer's disease, or Acad. This is the study that I'm involved with. Proudly, Toronto and Vancouver represent 40% of all the potential people that will be recruited into the Acad study. And what we want to represent is the first study on Alzheimer's disease in trans-Asian populations, with the goal of recruiting 5,000 individuals of Chinese, Korean, and Vietnamese descent. As the program grows, we do want to expand this to other Asian populations, and this allows parity with Caucasian population studies, as well as the increasing Hispanic and African American populations. In the United States, there are other 8 recruiting sites, including New York, and in California, there are 4 sites. And then we have supporting groups. This study is centered through University of Pennsylvania, and the biosamples will be collected at the Indiana University. So we've collected the leaders in the field to start doing some of these types of research, and I'm blessed to be part of this group. So why Acad? It's the heterogeneity of the disease that really is going to be important. So we want to capture as much of this information from willing participants as we can. And this is basically everything from lived experiences to health information to memory status, and potentially, and from genetics from saliva, or potentially from plasma, where we can also start to think about what might be a good plasma biomarker for identification of Alzheimer's disease. This is in line with the National Institutes of Health in the United States. It's their main funding agency to increase the diversity of populations to help address health-based issues on that. As I've said before, it's a threefold increase in dementia that's likely to occur in the next, by the next 20, 30 years. And then, so this study will be the largest to kind of capture this information on this. So the core goals is to collect data on genetics, lifestyle, and develops a potential kind of an intersection of those scores, what we call a polygenic risk score for individuals. And if we get plasma to do an analysis, is like help to predict what might be good biomarkers for this. And this also reflects into other populations because we want to make sure that, you know, we're able to kind of get this and it's robust enough that we can detect it across groups. The most important thing for me and a lot of the passion that I have is addressing community health literacy, increasing awareness for Alzheimer's disease and dementia, promoting brain health to Asian communities, but also all communities at large, and ensuring inclusion of Asians and other groups in to be participants in studies on Alzheimer's and dementia. And other healthcare aspects of this. This is something that, you know, has unfortunately not been as high, and we're kind of hoping that this will increase on that. Our volunteers will be of Chinese descent in the Toronto area, people over 60 with either Alzheimer's, and of course we need healthy controls to also compare it to. And part of it is also kind of to have families discuss brain health as an important aspect of this. As I mentioned, after people are enrolled in the study, after they express interest, we complete a lifestyle questionnaire. We do an assessment with a doctor to help assess potential other ailments. We do cognitive testing on individuals. And then we also ask for a DNA sample on that. And we can do this virtually. We've been doing that virtually for the last year successfully, as well as in person when time permits on this. And our timeline right now is we're currently in the first year of investigation. We have another year currently on our grant. We've submitted for renewal at the National Institutes of Health, and we're hoping by May we'll know a little bit more about whether it will be funded or resubmitted. And then likely in September, we will initiate the full 5,000 participant study on this. And then we want to kind of expand this. This is just the first part of the study and start to think about, you know, are there Asian specific biomarkers that kind of are important? Should other what can we get to other populations with potential funding to make sure we have inclusion of everyone in this? Thinking about at CAMH, we're a world leader in brain imaging, and thinking about how some of these biomarkers for dementia diagnosis might compare to brain imaging and how that precision medicine approach becomes a little bit more refined in our study. This can't happen without a dedicated and brilliant team that is part of Acad. Here are 4 individuals who have been in part of our study. We actually have a couple of managers who are also on the call who've been instrumental in the success of this program. So if anyone's interested in the study, this is the QR code. If you'd like to scan that, that gets you to a survey if you're interested in enrolling the study. If you have questions about Acad, you can email us at acadstudy@camh.ca. And if it doesn't matter if you're Asian or not, if you have questions, it's always open to have us help and address some of these issues. And if you're interested more about Alzheimer's disease and want to kind of go to several sites, not only is the Alzheimer's Society of Toronto available for resources, but acadstudy.org will kind of walk you through some of those types of things too. So thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it. And I'm happy to take questions.
Hi, Dr. Yu. Thank you so much for that. I do have one quick question. Some participants were asking if you were willing to share the slides from today.
Absolutely. I'm delighted to, and more importantly, I think if people want to have see the slides, if they have questions, I did a whirlwind tour, so I also want to make sure that people have an opportunity to understand it. If they have questions, please feel free to contact me.
Okay, so we have a series of questions. I'm just trying to scan. So
Sure.
the first one is regarding your sleep research, whether it's specific to Alzheimer's disease or any other type of dementia.
So right now, it's mostly our study is in mice. So, and we're trying to look at basically how sleep might disrupt learning and memory. So dementias in general, as well as understand how proteins build up. So I mentioned proteostasis, how the life cycle of proteins gets disrupted with sleeplessness on there. So there are other studies and other sleep studies that are looking at individuals with dementia and others, including, it's a risk factor for Parkinson's disease and Lewy body dementia.
So this question is really around intervention. So I know you showed that diagram of all those trajectory points where we could increase our risk. So the question is really, how do we know if those preventions are actually working or affecting the severity of disease?
Right. So, and it's very difficult to answer a yes or no. And my apologies, that's a typical scientist response on this. With lived experiences, many things can take place. But based on knowledge of what's gone on with controlled studies or individuals, we'll take traumatic brain injury as one example. So head injuries have been identified as a newer risk for Alzheimer's disease, only in the past decade. But we know that, head injuries in the 20s and 30s might cause other events like depression, like changing in motor skills and things like that. So it's a bit of how do you get to the root of dementia from a head injury that might have all these other steps that precede it. So we do think that what's going on is these are cumulative events. So if you take out one of these risk factors, you potentially try to change that curve. Let's say this is your risk, it increases with time because you're having these events. You might slightly shift them with one event, and then you might slightly shift it a little bit more with abating another risk factor. And so over time, multiple factors start to kind of reduce that risk or change that kind of increase risk as you age.
So you've also mentioned genetics in your presentation. So the question here is, how do we know if we have any of those genetics for early prevention? We need to have a doctor referral to do those tests, and if the doctor doesn't agree, then what?
Right. So right now, genetics isn't a diagnostic tool for Alzheimer's disease. There are very limited tools. They're tried and true in terms of memory assessments and things like that. In the US, one can take cerebral spinal fluid, so they'll do a lumbar puncture, and they can identify different proteins that are associated with Alzheimer's disease. There's increasing potential, actually in the US, they've approved some where they can do something called PET imaging, so positron emission tomography. So what they do is they look for the amyloid or tau in your brain cells, in your brain, and that will help them diagnose Alzheimer's disease. Genetics-wise, it's only people who have the mutations that can cause early onsets that will have an effect. The other ones, the late onset genes like ApoE4 are modifiers. So that doesn't mean that if you have the variant that you will get Alzheimer's disease. And again, it's similar to the risk factors. It increases your risk, but doesn't guarantee that you will have Alzheimer's or dementia.
There's another one, sort of genetic and then risk factors. So does genetics change if you change areas? So meaning if I was born in X country and then I move to Y country, does that change genetics as well as the risk factors?
Right. So you guys are going to hate me because I'm going to say there are two answers. No, your basic genetics doesn't change. But there is something called epigenetics, where some of your DNA, the basic molecules that create the genes can be slightly modified on that. And that doesn't necessarily refer to a relocation of an area, but it might be related to stress, your lived experiences, things like that. So moving itself doesn't necessarily change your genetics, but there are some considerations that are part of your lived experiences.
So this is another interesting question. Why is there more research that's concentrated on Alzheimer's disease rather than the other types? I know in our presentations, we often say that Alzheimer's is the most common, but the question is, how can we absolutely be sure that that's the most common if, say, there's limited research in the other areas?
Yeah. And I totally agree. I mean, there is about 60% of cases are people with Alzheimer's disease, but there's about 25% who are vascular dementia, which actually end up with very similar events as Alzheimer's disease. And there are individuals with something called frontal temporal dementia, which actually is a coverage of a bunch of other types of dementia that are related to tauopathy. The goal of a lot of the Alzheimer's research is to identify brain changes that cover the dementias. So vascular dementia kind of often is related to some of the amyloid changes and presents with some of the tau changes. Some of the frontal temporal dementia changes are often associated with tau changes that also kind of have some of these types of effects. So the coverage of Alzheimer's disease is not to neglect other research, other diseases, but is actually to kind of create a greater depth of research on that. And I agree, the heterogeneity includes understanding the different types of dementia. And we can kind of identify that with some of the imaging modalities. The magnetic resonance imaging might be able to tell you what parts of the brain seem to be affected more than other parts of the brain as it goes on. And that's going to be some of that knowledge base that we start to build up on that, is that it kind of looks like Alzheimer's disease because everyone thinks it's Alzheimer's disease, but with more knowledge, we can start to discriminate that it's not Alzheimer's, it might be frontal temporal, like a Pick's disease, or like a Lewy body dementia, which is like a Parkinson's disease, or a vascular dementia, because we can look at the MRI or the CAT scan to see that it's something different.
Okay, awesome. I think the next question that I have, maybe Natalie, you might be better suited. So for the studies that are listed on the TDRA, do you need to be 60 and over to participate, or how do we find out what the participation criteria is?
Yes, so you do not need to be 60 and older to participate in all of the studies. So for each of the listings, it will tell you the age qualifications to be able to participate. So that will be listed on every single research study, so you can check. And then if you filter when you're searching by the age group that you are a part of, it will give you all the studies that you're eligible for. So we have studies for all different age groups, not just 60 and above.
Okay. And I believe Acad is also listed there. So if they had questions, they could also find out through the TDRA, correct?
Yes.
Yes, correct.
Okay. So another question here that I see is you talked a lot about diversifying research. So the question is here is, have you studied differences between men and women with Alzheimer's disease risk factor? Some of the things are like hormones and pregnancies are also a question.
Yeah, and that's a great question, Sharon. Many other studies have looked at sex as a potential variable. We do know that the incidence rates for women is higher. So I helped commission a paper with the Society for Women Health Research, where we did look at sex differences and potentially all the types of variables that might take place, including hormones. Access to healthcare, women tend to be the caregiver and rarely the care seeker. And those can kind of impact one's trajectory in terms of developing cognitive impairment and Alzheimer's disease. So it is part and parcel of our research. We don't necessarily look at hormone changes. There are other groups that have kind of really fine-tuned that. But you know, so in terms of if we collect plasma samples, that might be a potential biomarker to look at individuals at time of donation of blood, that we can kind of look at some of these biomarkers. And so it's a very good question. It's an ongoing question in many studies.
Okay. So last question here is, if you examine populations of people 50 years and older from countries around the world, would you see much variation in Alzheimer's per capita? If so, are there any best practices from those populations that might be applicable to Canadians?
Yeah. And Doug, that's a great question. I think that that's actually one of the driving factors for why we're doing this, is to kind of understand what are the health outcomes among different populations in different countries. So part of our study is to reach out to our partners around the world to look at some of these factors, not just in Asian populations, but in Caucasian populations, Hispanic populations, African American ones, diasporas in other countries like Australia. So this is actually part of the study that we want to do ultimately, is what's best, what are the best practices, and how can we implement them, or how can we adopt them into the healthcare system. We're not going to defeat Alzheimer's disease by just drugs. And the care we know is devastating to the community in terms of costs, in terms of financial as well as personal human costs. So their best goal at best chances at this time is to kind of understand what works and how we can kind of build that into our places. What I can tell you is health literacy and understanding about brain health, that education aspect is really critical to make sure that we get to that point soon. So.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yu, for spending an hour of your time to answer your questions and also share all of this. I would also like to thank my co-host, Natalie, for doing this with me. I will be sending out the slides. Is it okay if I send the PDF that you sent to me earlier?
Absolutely. You might want to reduce the size of it. It's pretty big.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
So I will be sending that via email to everyone. And I also wanted to let you know that this session is recorded. So it will be available on the Alzheimer's Society of Toronto YouTube channel with all of our TDRA playlists, as well as on the TDRA itself. So it will be up in, I would say, a few weeks or so, just to make sure we do any post-editing if required. The next TDRA webinar is planned to be somewhere around May. We're in the initial stages of planning, so please do stay tuned for notice when that is available. So thank you everyone for your time, and we look forward to connecting with you in the future.
Bye.